A black CEO walked into a bank dressed casually. Minutes later, he was handcuffed, slapped, and humiliated. Then he made one call that changed everything. Gregory Lancaster adjusted his wristwatch and checked the time as he stepped out of his black Cadillac Escalade, parked along the curb outside Riverway National Bank in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio. The late afternoon sun reflected off the glass doors as he approached, hands in the pockets of his plain navy hoodie. No suit today, no tailored slacks, just a simple sweatshirt, jeans, and a well-worn pair of sneakers. If you didn't know who he was, you wouldn't think twice about him. And that was the point. Gregory had built his company from the ground up. Lancaster and Shaw Holdings, a multi-million-dollar investment firm, worked with banks all across the country. Some, like Riverway National, handled his company's accounts that saw more money flow through them in a month than some businesses made in a year. Gregory liked to believe that his financial partners treated their customers with dignity, regardless of who they were. But that belief had been shaken lately. Over the past few months, whispers of discrimination had reached his ears. Complaints from clients, stories about certain people getting different treatment based on how they looked, how they dressed. Gregory wanted to see for himself. He had sent executives before, but today he wanted the raw, unfiltered truth. So here he was. Not as Gregory Lancaster, CEO, but as a regular customer. The moment he stepped inside, a sharp, cool blast of air conditioning hit his skin. The bank had that corporate sterility, polished floors, stiff-backed chairs, muted conversations. Gregory scanned the room. A few customers waited in line. A teller at the counter smiled warmly at an elderly white man making a deposit. Another teller, a woman with straight auburn hair, glanced at Gregory as he walked up. Her smile faded. He noticed it immediately. A brief flicker of something in her eyes. Suspicion. Uncertainty. As if she was trying to figure out why he was here. He stepped forward. "Good afternoon," he said, keeping his tone even. The teller, Melissa Carter according to her nameplate, gave him a tight-lipped smile. "How can I help you?" Gregory pulled out his bank statement, neatly folded in his pocket. "I noticed an unauthorized service fee on my business account. I'd like to get that cleared up." She took the paper and scanned it. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "What account is this for?" Gregory gave her the details. Melissa typed into her computer, her lips pressing into a thin line. A few seconds passed. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. "This is a business account," she said. "Yes," Gregory nodded. "Lancaster and Shaw Holdings." Her expression didn't change, but her posture shifted. The look in her eyes hardened, doubt mixed with something else. "Do you have proof that you're authorized on this account?" Gregory tilted his head slightly. "My name is on the statement. That's my account number right there." Melissa didn't budge. "I need to see a business card or official identification tying you to the account." Gregory exhaled slowly. "You didn't ask the last customer for that," he pointed out. Melissa's face stiffened. "That's standard policy for business accounts, sir." Was it? He knew it wasn't. Still, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID card, placing it on the counter. "Here you go." Melissa barely glanced at it before tapping her nails against the desk. "I'll need to get my manager." She didn't say why. She didn't have to. Gregory watched as she walked briskly toward an office in the back. Through the glass door, he saw her lean in, speaking in hushed tones to a middle-aged man in a stiff grey suit. The man's gaze flicked toward Gregory through the glass. His lips pressed into a thin line. Gregory had been in enough boardrooms, enough negotiations to recognize when people were making assumptions about him. A bad feeling settled in his chest. But he wasn't going anywhere. Gregory leaned against the counter, his fingers resting lightly on the polished surface. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, a slow irritation built. He had seen this happen to others, heard stories, read reports, but it was something else entirely to experience it firsthand. Across the room, the manager, Richard Holloway, had stepped out of his office. Mid-50s, thinning hair, the kind of man who carried himself with quiet authority. His gaze landed on Gregory, and there it was, that moment of assessment. The way some people looked at you and decided, without knowing a single thing about you, who you were. Gregory met his eyes, holding his ground. Richard walked over, forcing a stiff smile. "Sir, I understand there's a concern with your account?" Gregory kept his tone steady. "That's right. There's an unauthorized service fee on my business account. I asked the teller to remove it." Richard glanced at the statement still on the counter, then back at Gregory. "May I ask what your connection is to this account?" A small, humorless chuckle almost escaped Gregory's lips. "Here we go. I own the company," he said plainly. Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Just for a second. I see. And do you have any documentation to verify that?" Gregory gestured toward his ID still sitting there. "It's all right there. The account is under Lancaster and Shaw Holdings. My name is Gregory Lancaster." Richard picked up the ID and studied it like it might be fake. Then he looked at the statement again, as if expecting to find a flaw, something that didn't add up. Finally, he set both down and folded his hands. "This is a high-value business account," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We have to be extra cautious about security measures." Gregory stared at him. "Security measures?" Richard gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We have to make sure everything checks out. We can't just take someone's word for it." Gregory exhaled through his nose. He knew exactly what was happening. He had millions in this bank. He had built companies, signed contracts with institutions bigger than this entire branch. And yet, right now, none of that mattered. Right now, he was just a black man in a hoodie questioning a fee, and that apparently was enough to make him a problem. He kept his voice calm. "Let me get this straight. You're telling me that despite my name being on the account, despite my ID matching, despite the fact that I can answer any security question you throw at me, you still don't think I should have access to my own money?" Melissa, still standing behind the counter, shifted uncomfortably. Richard didn't flinch. "I'm saying we need to verify everything properly before making any changes." Gregory nodded slowly. "Fine. Let's do that then. Call the number attached to the account. You'll see my assistant will verify everything." Richard hesitated, because that would be too easy. Gregory saw it written all over his face. The man wasn't looking for verification. He was looking for a way to deny him. "You know what?" Gregory said, shaking his head. "I'd like to speak to the regional director. I know for a fact this isn't your bank's policy. And Richard lifted a hand. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice." Gregory blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're causing a disturbance." There it was. The moment he had been waiting for but dreading at the same time. He had seen other men, other women in his position, faced with the same game. Push them just enough, ignore their patience, and the second they raise their voice, even slightly, it's a problem. He forced himself to breathe, keeping his hands relaxed at his sides. "My voice is normal, just like yours," he said quietly. "Now, if you want to verify the account, let's do it. Otherwise, I'll be contacting my legal team." That should have been the end of it, but Richard had already made up his mind. His eyes flicked to the side. Gregory followed his gaze, toward the security guard standing near the door. A large man, mid-40s, built like an ex-football player. Gregory had barely noticed him before, but now the guy was watching him closely. Richard turned back to Gregory. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A slow, sinking feeling settled in Gregory's stomach. "For what?" Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he was dealing with someone unreasonable. "You're making staff uncomfortable. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have to call security." Gregory felt his jaw tighten. Melissa was now avoiding eye contact. The other teller was watching from the corner of her eye. Customers had started to take notice. He had come in for a simple inquiry, and now he was being treated like a threat. But he wasn't going to just walk away. Gregory stayed exactly where he was, his hands still resting on the counter. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't making a scene. But somehow, he was the problem. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples like he was losing patience. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. You need to leave." Gregory met his eyes. "You're denying me service because I asked about an unauthorized fee?" "I'm denying you service because you're being disruptive," Richard shot back. "Now you can either leave on your own, or I can have you escorted out." Gregory let out a slow breath. He had seen this play out before, just never from this side of the counter. The moment he walked out, they would spin the story. Aggressive customer, caused a scene. Staff feared for their safety. If he left, he lost. So he didn't move. "You can call whoever you need to," Gregory said, his voice steady. "But I'm not leaving until my account is handled." Richard's eyes flicked over to the security guard again. A silent signal. The guard, a thick-set man with a shaved head and a badge that read L. Pearson, walked toward them, his steps slow, deliberate. "Sir," Pearson said, his voice deep and firm, "we're going to have to escort you out." Gregory turned toward him, keeping his posture relaxed. "On what grounds?" "You're making the employees uncomfortable." That word again. Uncomfortable, not threatened, not in danger, just uncomfortable. The guard took another step. "Let's go." Gregory didn't move. "I'm asking about my own money. That's not a crime." Pearson's expression didn't change. "I won't ask again." Gregory felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. The frustration of knowing he was being treated differently, knowing that no matter how calm he stayed, he was already being labeled as a problem. But before he could say another word, Pearson reached out and grabbed his arm. The moment was so quick, so unnecessary, that for a second Gregory just stood there, stunned. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't yelling. But now a hand was on him, forcing him toward the exit. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Get your hand off me!" Pearson didn't let go. "I said, let's go. I said, take your hand off me," Gregory repeated, his voice lower this time. A few heads turned. Someone near the waiting area pulled out their phone. But then, it happened. Melissa gasped. Someone let out a sharp, "Oh my God!" Gregory barely saw it coming. A slap. Not from Pearson, but from Richard. It wasn't hard enough to knock him down, but it landed. Open palm, sharp against his cheek. The whole bank went silent. For a second, no one moved. Then Pearson yanked Gregory's arms behind his back. Hard. "You're under arrest," the guard muttered. Gregory felt the cold bite of metal snap around his wrists. The realization hit all at once. They weren't just kicking him out. They were trying to make an example out of him. The cold bite of the handcuffs sent a surge of anger through Gregory's chest. His arms were wrenched behind his back, the steel pressing into his wrists as if he were some violent criminal, some dangerous threat, all because he had questioned a bank fee. The slap still burned on his cheek, but it wasn't the sting of the hit that got to him. It was the audacity. The quiet in the bank felt suffocating. Everyone had seen what just happened, how quickly a business inquiry turned into an arrest, and yet no one stepped forward. No one said a word. Gregory let out a slow, steady breath. He knew how this looked. A black man in handcuffs, a bank manager standing over him, rubbing his palm like he was the one who had been attacked. Security restraining him like he was about to lash out. And the worst part? None of them knew who they were dealing with. Richard adjusted his tie, exhaling sharply like the whole situation was an inconvenience to him. "Call the police," he told Melissa. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly over the phone. For a second, just a second, Gregory thought she might refuse. But she didn't. Her fingers punched in the numbers. Gregory kept his voice measured. "You sure you want to do this?" Richard scoffed. "You put your hands on my security officer." Gregory's lips curled into a bitter smirk. "That's a lie, and you know it." Richard ignored him, turning to Pearson. "Make sure he doesn't move." The guard's grip tightened. Melissa spoke softly into the phone. "Yes, we have a disturbance at the bank. A customer refusing to leave. It's escalating." Gregory almost laughed. Escalating. He had barely moved. They were the ones who escalated it. A woman near the waiting area shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her phone was still recording, the screen tilted ever so slightly in Gregory's direction. Good. At least someone thought this was worth documenting. Gregory clenched his jaw, keeping his breathing slow. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then, the sound of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the glass doors. A patrol car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out. Pearson loosened his grip slightly, but not enough for Gregory to move. Richard put on a face of calm authority, the kind that suggested he was in control of the situation. He straightened his posture as the first officer, a lean man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes, stepped inside. His badge read Sergeant Bradley Wilkes. Wilkes took one look at Gregory, then at the handcuffs, then back at Richard. "What's going on here?" Richard gestured toward Gregory. "This man was causing a disturbance, refused to leave when asked, and then got physical with my staff." Gregory held his tongue for a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he said, "That's not what happened." Wilkes turned to Pearson. "What's your side?" Pearson shrugged. "We asked him to leave. He wouldn't." Wilkes studied Gregory for a beat. "What's your name, sir?" Gregory didn't answer immediately. He wanted to see just how far they'd take this. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm. "Even Gregory Lancaster." Wilkes didn't react at first. He just jotted it down. "And do you have ID?" Gregory smirked. "It's on the counter." Wilkes glanced at Melissa. She nodded and slid the ID toward him. The second Wilkes read the name, something in his face changed. Subtle, but it was there. His eyes flicked to Richard, then back to Gregory. "You own Lancaster and Shaw Holdings?" Gregory tilted his head slightly. "That's right." Wilkes looked over at Richard again. His posture wasn't so stiff now. There was a flicker of doubt, the kind that only showed up when someone realized they might have just made a very big mistake. Richard's mouth opened slightly, then shut again. The shift was almost palpable, but Gregory wasn't finished yet. He turned his attention back to Wilkes, watching the officer carefully. "You still planning to take me in?" Wilkes hesitated. He could feel the weight of the room now, the recording phone, the fact that if he arrested the wrong man, this would go beyond a routine call. Then, finally, "Take off the cuffs." Pearson hesitated. "I said take them off," Wilkes repeated, firmer this time. The security guard's jaw tightened, but after a beat, he unclasped the cuffs. Gregory rolled his wrists, flexing his fingers. He looked down at his ID, still in Wilkes's hand. "I'll take that back now." Wilkes handed it over, clearing his throat. "Sorry for the—" Gregory raised a hand. "Don't. Just don't." He slipped the ID back into his pocket, then turned to Richard. The bank manager had gone pale, because now it was all starting to click. He had tried to humiliate a man who owned more of this bank than he ever would. Gregory straightened his hoodie, exhaled once, then pulled out his phone. It was time to end this. Gregory held his phone up, his thumb hovering over the screen. The air inside the bank was so thick with tension you could cut it with a knife. No one spoke. Not the tellers, not the customers watching from the waiting area, not even the security guard who had just uncuffed him. Richard, the manager, looked like he had swallowed a stone. His eyes darted between Gregory's face and the phone in his hand, realization creeping in with every second of silence. Gregory let the weight of the moment settle before he finally pressed a contact. The phone rang once, twice. Then, "Mr. Lancaster?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. John Whitmore, the regional director of Riverway National Bank. Richard's boss. "John?" Gregory said casually, his tone light, almost friendly. "I'm standing inside your downtown Cincinnati branch, and I have a bit of a situation." A pause. Then a shift in John's voice. "What kind of situation, sir?" Gregory's eyes never left Richard. "Well," he said slowly, "I came in to question a small, unauthorized fee on one of my business accounts. Instead of assistance, I was met with suspicion. Instead of respect, I was accused of causing a disturbance. Instead of a simple conversation, I was slapped in the face by your branch manager and put in handcuffs by security. Silence. Even through the phone, Gregory could feel the shock on the other end. Excuse me. John's voice had dropped, now tinged with disbelief. Gregory let the words sink in. I'll be filing a formal complaint, of course, but I thought you'd want to handle this internally before it reaches broader channels. Richard visibly paled. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, like he wanted to defend himself, but knew there was no way to spin this. John's response was swift. Mr. Lancaster, I am deeply sorry. I will be handling this immediately. That's good to hear, Gregory said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Because I have a feeling that by the end of the day, this branch is going to need some new staff. Richard stiffened. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. He knew. Melissa, standing behind the counter, looked like she wanted to disappear. The regional director's voice returned, firm, decisive. Mr. Lancaster, if you could stay put for a few minutes, I'm sending my team down now. This will be addressed immediately. Gregory's smile was polite, cold, razor sharp. I'll be here. He hung up. Richard finally found his voice. Mr. Lancaster, Gregory turned to him, eyes calm but steely. You put your hands on a customer. Richard swallowed hard. Gregory stepped closer, his voice low but cutting. You saw my name on the account and still treated me like I didn't belong. You assumed things about me because of how I looked, and instead of owning it, you doubled down. Richard opened his mouth again, but no words came out. Gregory leaned in just slightly. Tell me, was it worth it? Richard's face flushed with humiliation, but Gregory didn't wait for an answer. He already knew it. Outside, another set of tires screeched into the parking lot. Corporate was here, and Richard's time was up. The glass doors swung open, and 3 men in dark suits strode inside. They weren't here to make a deposit. Gregory recognized John Whitmore instantly. Mid-50s, sharp blue eyes, the kind of man who measured every word before speaking. Behind him were 2 other executives, their expressions unreadable, but their presence alone making one thing very clear. This wasn't going to be a discussion. The entire bank staff looked frozen in place. Melissa swallowed hard, her hands twisting together. The security guard, Pearson, stood rigid, his jaw clenched. And Richard? Richard looked like a man who had already accepted his fate. John's gaze swept the room, landing on Gregory first. He extended a hand. Mr. Lancaster, again, I cannot express how deeply we regret this. Gregory shook his hand firmly, but his eyes didn't leave Richard. I assume you've been briefed? John exhaled, then turned toward Richard. His expression was blank, his tone neutral, but there was an edge to it. Richard, I need you to step into your office. Richard hesitated for half a second, then squared his shoulders and led the way. But Gregory? He didn't move. John glanced at him. I'm staying, Gregory said simply. I want to hear exactly how you handle this. For a moment, John said nothing. Then, with a small nod, he gestured toward the door. By all means. The office was small, but the tension inside could have filled a stadium. Richard stood near his desk, gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. John took a seat across from him, flipping open a leather notebook. One of the other executives pulled out his phone and hit record. Gregory leaned against the wall, arms crossed. John started. I've reviewed the footage from the security cameras. Richard's face drained of color. Let's be clear, John continued. Not only did you fail to follow protocol, but you physically assaulted a client. A high-level client with extensive holdings in this bank. Richard opened his mouth, but John held up a hand. No excuses. You knew exactly what you were doing. Melissa, still outside the office but within earshot, lowered her head. John leaned forward. Effective immediately. You are terminated from Riverway National Bank. Security will escort you out. Richard let out a shaky breath. I've worked here for 20 years. John's expression didn't change. And today, you threw all of that away. Richard looked at Gregory then, a mix of regret, anger, and shame in his eyes. But Gregory didn't look away. You thought I was beneath you, Gregory said, his voice even, unwavering. You didn't see a customer. You saw a problem. And now you're the problem. Richard swallowed but said nothing. What could he say? John glanced toward the security guard standing near the doorway. Escort him out. Pearson hesitated, but then, with a stiff nod, moved toward Richard. The former bank manager didn't resist. He walked out without another word, his steps slow, defeated. Gregory followed them back into the main lobby, where the rest of the staff stood in awkward silence. John turned toward them. I hope you all understand something, he said, his voice carrying through the room. This is not how we treat people. If any of you feel the need to question that, consider this your notice as well. Nobody spoke. Melissa shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, her lips pressed together. Gregory tilted his head. And her? He asked, nodding toward her. John turned, giving her a long, unreadable look. Melissa, do you have anything to say? She hesitated. Gregory raised an eyebrow. He knew what was happening. This was her moment. She could own her part in it, or she could pretend she hadn't been complicit. Finally, in a small, tight voice, she whispered, I should have said something. John nodded once. Yes, you should have. A tense silence stretched between them. Then John exhaled. You're on probation. I suggest you make good use of it. Melissa's shoulders slumped, but she nodded quickly. Gregory turned to John. And the security guard? John's gaze flicked to Pearson. The guard stiffened under the attention. Consider this your last shift, John said. Turn in your badge before you leave today. Pearson's jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. Gregory watched the man take a slow step back. No resistance now. No firm grip, just silent. And then, just like that, it was over. The people who had assumed the worst about him? Gone. The people who stood by and did nothing? On notice. Gregory Lancaster had walked into this bank as a man with questions. He left as the man who gave them answers they'd never forget. Gregory walked out of the bank, the afternoon sun hitting his face as he inhaled the cool air. The weight in his chest, the one that had been building the moment he stepped inside, was finally gone. But the reality of what had just happened, that would stay with him. He had come here for a simple answer about an unauthorized fee. Instead, he had been treated like he didn't belong, like his presence was a disruption, like his own money wasn't his to question. And the worst part? This wasn't new. This was the reality for so many people who didn't have the power to fight back, who couldn't make a single phone call and have an entire management team sent in to clean up the mess. Gregory knew that if he had been anyone else, anyone without his status, his resources, his name, this would have ended differently. He had felt it in the way Richard spoke to him, in the way Melissa hesitated, in the way security had been so quick to put their hands on him. They hadn't expected him to fight back. They had expected him to take it. And that's what made him angrier than anything. Gregory turned his head slightly, glancing back at the glass doors of Riverway National Bank. Through the reflection, he saw Melissa standing behind the counter, staring at her hands. He saw Pearson gathering his things. He saw customers whispering, some shaking their heads, others watching with quiet understanding. How many times had this happened before? And how many times had no one done a damn thing? Gregory pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number. His chief financial officer, Brian. The call rang twice before Brian picked up. Hey, boss. What's up? Gregory exhaled. Find another bank. Brian was silent for a second. You sure? I'm sure. He didn't have to explain. Brian had been with him long enough to know. Consider it done, Brian said. Gregory hung up. Riverway National had just lost a client worth millions. But more importantly, they had lost something far greater. Trust. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't about how much money you have, or what you wear, or what title sits under your name. Respect is about recognizing the worth of every person who walks through that door. And today, they had learned that lesson the hard way. Gregory took one last glance at the bank before shaking his head and walking away. But the story wouldn't end here. Because next time, it might not be someone like him standing at that counter. And next time, someone else might not have the power to fight back. But they should. And that was something he could change. Stories like this happen every day, but they don't have to. Respect is a choice, a mindset, a responsibility. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, share it, speak about it, challenge it when you see it happen, because respect isn't about appearances, it's about humanity.